welcome everybody to our May iteration of the Critical Antiquities workshop. I think this is our third workshop for the year so far, isn't it? Right. And so I'll begin, of course, as is traditional, by acknowledging the complement to the meeting today. We acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's the land on which the University of Sydney is founded. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce in the Critical Antiquities workshop Mirko Canevaro from the University of Edinburgh, who is also currently the R.D. Milnes Visiting Professor at the University of Queensland. Let me just introduce Mirko. Mirko studied classics at the Università degli Studi di Torino, did his PhD in classics at Durham University, and has an enviable list of awards: Alexander von Humboldt Postdoctoral Fellowship in Mannheim, Chancellor's Fellowship in Classics at the University of Edinburgh, was Reader in Greek History, now Professor of Greek History at the University of Edinburgh, recipient of the Leverhulme Prize, Visiting Professor of Greek History at the Università degli Studi di Cagliari, has received European Research Council grant project. That's a continuing honour in classical Greece.
Just finished.
Just finished.
Start a new one.
Mirko is also a member of the Academia Europaea, Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, was a visiting professor at the École des Études Sciences Sociales in Paris, visiting professor in historical anthropology of the ancient world at the Università degli Studi di Siena. Mirko has contributed columns on politics, culture and higher education for newspapers in Italy in particular, and also, fascinatingly, I think, as you've said, this is a project very dear to your heart. With your partner, you are the co-founder of the Network for Working Class Classicists, and you've produced the first UK class in classics report, and we might even put a link to that up on our Critical Antiquities website. Mirko is also chair of the Classical Association of Scotland and a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, as I mentioned before. Mirko has published some very important monographs, is the co-author of a couple of very important commentaries on Aristotle's Politics, Book 4, Book 7, Book 8. Mirko has also published a definitive commentary on Demosthenes against Latines, and also a wonderful, with Oxford University Press, a wonderful collection of the documents in the Attic Orators, the laws and decrees and public speeches of the Demosthenic corpus. Mirko has also is co-edited 9 volumes of collected essays, and has an enviable long list of published book chapters and articles. And it is a great pleasure today that he's speaking for our workshop on the topic of the hubris of the downtrodden, honour and social control in ancient Greek society. And I'm going to add that this is also part of this new project that you've got, which is on class in classical Athens, or class in
ancient Greek democracy.
In ancient Greek democracy. Okay, yes. So let's make.
I like this Australian habit of clapping before one reads the paper. It just it takes the pressure away. I've been clapped, so that's like whatever happens. We are well. Thank you very much for having me. This is I'm at the tail end of my Australian adventure, and it's been wonderful. And so this is an opportunity to meet some colleagues in Sydney and also online, as I see. So as Ben was saying, and thank you very much for the lovely introduction. Yeah, this paper, the same as the one I will give later today, in a way. There are 2 papers that, in a way, kind of are in between 2 projects. I was lucky enough to co-lead an ERC grant on honouring ancient Greeks for 6 years. It was supposed to be 5, but then we were extended because of COVID, which is just finished. And of course, a big part of that was how people conceptualize the notions of honors, ideas of inequality, and of differential respect and recognition, and therefore issues of class issues of status and so on were very central. The next one is going to be about class in ancient Greek democracy, and you see from this project that we kind of go across all of these issues. But we'll talk about hubris, but it will be a way into strategies of social control, I guess. So, next slide. So hubris is typically something that affects the rich and powerful. It has to do with the self-assertion of those who are superior, which leads them to disrespect their alleged inferiors. Greek thought provides something akin to a standard social diagnosis of excessive good luck, prompting excessive self-assertion, hubristic behavior, and the breaking of communal norms, and ultimately resulting in the downfall of the hubris test. A social diagnosis that has been explored in detail, most prominently by Douglas McDowell, Nick Fisher, and Douglas Keynes. The prototypicality of this scenario of hubristic behavior, underpinned by one's hubristic character, is on full display not only in literary texts, but also in the evidence of the judicial speeches extant from classical Athens. In Athens, hubris was a punishable offense, and when someone is accused of it, the picture is normally that of a rich individual who is excessively full of himself, believes he's better than his fellow citizens, and therefore exhibits contempt towards them, disrespects them, and refuses to acknowledge their legitimate claims to time, as well as the widely endorsed social norms that underpin them. Next slide. The picture of the hubris and of the prototypical hubris, of this picture of hubris and of the prototypical hubris test has significant points of contact with the modern scientific and journalistic usage of the term hubris with a U. To make distinction, I do hubris with a Y when it's ancient and hubris with a U when it's modern, to indicate dangerous forms of pride and overconfidence typical of the rich and powerful. Recent studies of hubris with a U, particularly under the aegis of the Daedalus Trust, as a pathological syndrome characterized by specific traits, argue that this is manifested in our day, particularly in leadership, management, and politics. And these studies and this approach to modern hubris do seem to find significant purchase in the prototypical ancient picture of hubris that I just painted. Both hubris with a Y and hubris with a U seem to indicate a character defect found normally in the fortunate, the rich, and the powerful, that manifests itself in failures of leadership, in arrogance in dealing with others, and which tends to lead to one's downfall because of an overestimation of one's qualities, claims, and strengths. Next slide. Michael Sandel has recently spoken in his bestseller, The Tyranny of Merit, of meritocratic hubris. And the definition he provides matches remarkably well both modern uses of hubris and the prototypical notion of hubris isolated in the best scholarship on the ancient Greek concept. I quote, "Meritocratic hubris is the tendency of the successful to inhale too deeply of their success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way. It goes along with the tendency to look down on those less fortunate and less credentialed than themselves. That gives rise to the sense of humiliation and resentment of those who are left out." Next slide. Greek literature and history are replete with powerful characters overestimating their claims to honor and disrespecting others on account of that overestimation. Whether it is a Homeric Basileus, like Agamemnon, or a conceited, violent, and disdainful wealthy citizen like Midias, calling out the powerful as hubristic is instrumental to containing their arrogance, limiting their superiority and aggression, and therefore protecting the rights of the other, weaker members of the community. Often, such accusations of prototypical top-down, we may call it hubris, are combined with accusations of bottom-up hubris committed by the high and mighty towards the gods. As they overestimate their claims to time and therefore deny the legitimate claims to time of others, not only do the high and mighty mistreat their inferiors, they also disrespect their superiors, the gods. As scholars have long noted, characterizing the hubris of the high and mighty as directed also upwards towards the gods with the inevitable ensuing downfall,
at once provides some consolation to the downtrodden, lends divine sanction to their indignation, contributes to reinforcing the condemnation of the downward hubris of the superior, and therefore can contribute to curtailing the excesses and protecting the weaker against their abuses. Next slide. But accusations of bottom-up hubris do not pertain exclusively to offenses normally committed by the powerful against the gods, and do not only serve as further underpinning to condemnations of the top-down hubris of the high and mighty. Standard examples of ancient hubris are in fact bottom-up, most notably the recurrent hubris of plants and animals, which are represented as hubristic when they fail to perform the functions to which humans want to subject them. In these instances, the animals or the plants' resistance constitutes hubris because it is assumed that there exists a definite hierarchy between humans on the one hand and plants and animals on the other. Because of this hierarchy, plants and animals are meant to show appropriate deference towards their human superiors, and their resistance constitutes a form of exuberance, arrogance, or overstepping. Here, then, hubris does not indicate arrogance and abuse from the superior, therefore curtailing the excesses of the powerful and implicitly affirming the dignity and the claims, the time, of the inferior. Rather, it puts the inferior in its place, reaffirming a hierarchy and representing challenges to that hierarchy as a form of arrogance. Next slide. Similar accusations of bottom-up hubris are not limited to plants and animals. We find, in fact, a large cast of characters and social groups in Greek literature and history that match this account of bottom-up hubris and are characterized as hubristic by their social superiors. That hubris could be used also to indicate such a lack of deference towards superiors is a significant difference between the ancient concept and modern usage and theorizations of hubris with a U. It is a difference that I think warrants further investigation. What is the function of such accusations of bottom-up hubris? What kinds of behavior, what claims, what actions are called out as evidence of the hubris of the inferior? If accusations of hubris against the high and mighty imply an appeal to an egalitarian social order, or at least to a social order whereby the inferior are not treated as worthless, but have instead a legitimate claim, some legitimate claims and rights despite their inferiority, what kind of social order is presupposed by accusations of hubris against the poor, the humble, or even just against the relatively inferior? So in what follows, I shall first go back to Aristotle's account of hubris in the Rhetoric to identify some salient features of bottom-up hubris and to explain why hubris can manifest itself both top-down and bottom-up. I shall then investigate instances of accusations of bottom-up hubris concerned with the lower classes, with interstate relations, with enslaved persons, and with women. Finally, I shall show that such accusations of bottom-up hubris addressed at the downtrodden are in fact recurrent also in our time, even though we do not label them as examples of hubris with a U or a Y. The ancient concept of hubris helps us to identify and thematize them, further evidence of its analytic potential beyond the uses to which its modern homonym is put in modern theory and probably public discourse. So, next slide. Aristotle. As Fisher and Cairns have long shown, Aristotle's account of hubris matches the prototypical portrait of the hubris test as rich, often young, his hubris connected with a sense of superiority. In this passage of the Rhetoric, that you have on screen, however, we find a slightly different scenario. I quote, "And people think they are entitled to be treated with respect by those inferior in birth, in power, in virtue, and generally in whatever they themselves have much of. For example, in regard to money, a rich man thinks himself superior to a poor man, and in regard to speech, an eloquent one thinks himself superior to one unable to express himself, and a ruler thinks himself superior to one who is ruled, and one thinking himself worthy to rule thinks himself superior to one worthy to be ruled." Here, in describing the kind of hubris and disrespect that arouses anger, that prototypical superior-inferior relation is inverted. It is the superior who is angry at the inferior's hubris. He is in fact all the angrier because the inferior has failed to acknowledge his superiority and to behave accordingly, whatever the grounds of that superiority. This failure to recognize another's superiority constitutes hubris and as such arouses the other's anger. Of course, this refusal to acknowledge another's superiority is connected, as Aristotle has pointed out in a previous passage, with the fact that hubristae think they themselves become more superior by ill-treating others. But this does not change the fact that hubris here appears to have to do not with accepting one's inferiority in birth, in power, in virtue. It appears to have to do with not accepting one's inferiority in birth, in power, in virtue, in wealth, in eloquence, or whatever, rather than with overconfidence in one's superiority that leads one to arrogance and contempt of others. Next slide. Later on, in this passage, Aristotle clarifies why this is so. I quote, "And they become angry more at those of no account if they belittle them in some way. For anger resulting from being belittled is assumed to be against those who have no right to do it, and inferiors have no right to belittle." The hubris and the other forms of behavior that arouse anger are therefore a matter of comparison and of social norms. He who does not treat others as is appropriate and required, as they deserve on the basis of their relative inferiority or superiority, is guilty of hubris. If one is inferior, he has no right to treat another as if he was superior, and doing so constitutes belittling. Acknowledging that hubris has to do with dynamics of time, which is the great merits of Nick Fisher's study, and with social norms, and is therefore fundamentally comparative, goes a long way towards making sense of why it can manifest itself as disrespect and contempt, both by a superior for an inferior and by an inferior for a superior. It has to do with not knowing your place, and as a result, with not treating others as they deserve, whatever the relative time of the two parties. A superior can mistakenly believe himself to be even more superior than he actually is. He can overestimate his superiority, and as a result, deny an inferior even the limited respect he owes him. And an inferior can get above himself and fail to recognize the superiority of the superior. Both cases would fall under the rubric of hubris. In fact, there is a third possible case. One can treat an equal as if he were an inferior, believing himself mistakenly to be his superior, and that would also be hubris. Next slide. The passage I quoted above, this one here, showcases a further key feature of ancient hubris. It shows that hubris is a matter of perspective, of constructing a given set of actions and interactions in a particular way, of telling ourselves a particular story about how things went wrong. It's why hubris is so productive as a literary team, because hubris has to do with narrative. You have to construct a story about it. According to Aristotle, it is those who think, oiestai, that it is appropriate that they should be treated with deference by those who are inferior in some respect, birth, power, virtue, that get particularly angry when they are not. Behind their anger, and therefore behind their perception of another's hubristic behavior, is not just the other's behavior, attitude, or character. These are filtered through their point of view, and the relevant social norms that prescribe deference towards a superior are also somehow picked and chosen. Their criterion of superiority, inferiority of choice is, Aristotle says, whatever they themselves have much of. This is not idiosyncratic. Aristotle's whole account of anger and of other emotions in describing the conditions for a certain emotional reaction is focalized with reference to the agent and his motivations, and showcases the centrality of fantasia. It is a certain representation or self-representation, a certain construction of a situation, of a behavior, or of a circumstance that arouses anger. Hubris, as it were, is in the eye of the beholder. The key feature of hubris that it is not just there, but rather is dependent on a given perspective, on a particular self-representation of certain actions, behaviors, and attitudes, and on underlying notions of justice, also accounts for a recurrent pattern in our sources. Next slide. Often, the superior who accuses the insufficiently differential inferior of hubris is himself accused of hubris or represented as a hubris test. A notable example of this pattern is found in Sophocles' Antigone at line 473 to 83. There, Creon accuses Antigone of hubris for daring to justify her position, her choice, not to abide by his decree, showing therefore insufficient deference towards his authority and laying claim to a status and to prerogatives that do not belong to her. Yet the unquestioned authority to which Creon himself lays claim from another perspective, in fact, one may argue from the perspective that underlies the play's very development, one that is ultimately acknowledged by Creon himself, is not justified, and his laying claim to it is itself a form of overreaching, a form of hubris, which leads to his downfall in Athens. Such counter-accusations appear, in fact, in several of the passages that I'll analyze in the rest of this paper. Lamenting the hubris of insufficiently differential inferiors is often itself a sign of hubris. They show that hubris is indeed a matter of perspective, and that accusing another of hubris implicitly assumes and attempts to establish a certain idea of justice, of a good social order. When our sources speak of hubris, they are not just talking of a syndrome, as modern accounts would like, of a generic character defect. They are negotiating issues of just or unjust superiority and inferiority. They are talking about equality and inequality, and about justice. Next slide. A remarkable and complex example of alleged bottom-up hubris is found in Sophocles' Ajax, which is serendipitous, as Peter is about to publish the Ajax, apparently. In the passage you have on screen, in a speech pronounced by Menelaus. Menelaus announces that it is the sign of a bad person when a man who is a commoner, Demotes, disdains to pay respect to his superior. In the following lines, Menelaus proceeds to reveal in what sense precisely such a man is a bad person. His conduct constitutes hubris, and where such hubris is countenanced, the polis is bound in time to plummet to the depths, whereas it is saved by fear and eidos, which is both shame and due respect. While Menelaus' overall argument in these lines seems to be consistent both with traditional attitudes to hubris and eidos and with contemporary discussions of civic life, the opening of Menelaus' speech is rather incongruous, because the target of this characterization, Ajax, is hardly a commoner, a Demotes, given his family pedigree and heroic stature, and whatever his infractions. And in fact, Menelaus' speech seems somewhat to oscillate between two contrasting pictures of Ajax. On the one hand, it describes Ajax as a commoner who, in attempting to slaughter the kings, set himself against his betters, committing thus the hubris of the inferior toward the superior. On the other hand, it paints a more prototypical picture of Ajax becoming hubris-stressed on account of his superior strength, his body great and mighty, which blinded him to the reversals of fortune that are always imminent, and to the precarity of his own condition, and led him to ignore the rights of others in his attempt to kill them, in effect. Menelaus is a very unsympathetic character in Sophocles' Ajax. He is the antagonist of the story. He is himself represented as guilty of hubris, as he comes close to admitting just a few lines later. They run in alternation to these things. This fellow was a flagrant hubris test before, but now it is my turn to think big, which is often a periphrasis to indicate hubris. And his words about Ajax, it is the sign of a bad person when a man who is a commoner disdains to pay respect to his superiors, in all their incongruity, are meant to contribute to his negative portrayal. In fact, these words were likely to be perceived by the audience of the play not just as incongruous, but also as offensive. Because the core audience of the play, the Athenian demos gathered in the theater of Dionysus, is unlikely to have shared Menelaus' sentiment. Democratic Athens is very much the place where the commoners, the demotoi, do not show deference for, nor do they unquestioningly obey their alleged social superiors. Far from it. The Athenian demos was, I would argue, by and large, in control of the institutions of democracy. They were at home in them, had ownership over them. They participated actively in most capacities. They argued with elite individuals on an equal footing, as Plato says in the Protagoras, complaining about it. How dare them? They contributed directly to council and assembly debates, delivering speeches, making proposals, and shaping policy. They were publicly honored for their performance in office as magistrates selected by lot, in the same way as rich individuals were for their supererogatory acts of ergotism. The honorary decrees were basically identical. Same language, same positioning. There was no difference between a random guy that had just served as a secretary and a big general that had won a battle. Because of this political and ideological setup, most of the accusations of hubris that we find in Athenian democratic sources, whether they are formal accusations in court through a graphe hubris or informal ones, are levied against the rich and powerful. Their hubris consists in believing themselves superior to their fellow citizens and therefore failing to respect their rights, their time. Such accusations assume and at the same time enact the democratic equality of all citizens, their shared rights, and the illegitimacy of any hierarchy within the citizen body. By contrast, Menelaus's words take for granted that there is in fact a hierarchy and that the demoti are at the bottom of it, with a duty to obey their betters. They should not dare to set themselves on a level with them, and if they do, that's hubris. Menelaus's words are fundamentally anti-democratic, and in putting them in Menelaus's mouth, Sophocles attributes to him sentiments that are not just generically anti-democratic, but were in fact common among the more oligarchically inclined of the Athenian elite, as well as among oligarchies outside Athens. Next slide. These are the kinds of positions that we find voiced in the constitution of the Athenians by the so-called old oligarch, as well as, for instance, in Plato's dialogues, and still, to a lesser extent, in Aristotle, and which will, a few years later, give rise to the oligarchic revolutions of 411, and even more dramatically, 4544, with the regime of the 30. These positions hold that the people, the commoners, are unworthy of political power and participation. They argue for their exclusion as unworthy either by conflating social standing with moral worth. For example, in the constitution of the Athenians, we find that the poor, the penetes, the lower and therefore inferior class, oikeiros, are automatically the undisciplined, mainomενoi, the worst class, to kakiston, and of course the bad, the worthless, oiponeroi. Or by linking worth with virtue and virtue with liberality, which depends on skole, free time, which of course in turn depends on money. You need to have money to have free time, which automatically disqualifies those engaged in manual labor, who cannot be virtuous and therefore cannot be worthy of participation. And this is an argument that is made most prominently by Plato and Aristotle, and was very popular ever since. If the lower classes are understood to be based on the criteria of worth preferred by the more oligarchically minded among the elite, unworthy of rights of political participation and political power, then the degree of control they exercise over the Athenian constitution is, from their point of view, and vis-a-vis the superior worth of their betters, a form of unwarranted overreaching. It is hubris. And our sources confirm that Athenian democracy was regularly understood and painted in oligarchic context and circles as a political regime characterized by the hubris of the masses. Two examples will suffice, next slide, to illustrate this ideological move, whose ultimate aim was to disqualify the lower classes as unworthy of political rights, to put them back in their place, as it were. One comes from Plutarch's Life of Pericles, in a passage where he openly relies on 5th and 4th century sources. In commenting on Ephialtes, who destroyed the power of the Council of the Areopagus, giving too much undiluted freedom, which is a quotation from Plato, to the people, he observed that, as a result, the people broke into hubris and, as the comic poets say, just like a horse, no longer had the patience to obey the rein, but nabbed Euboea and trampled on the islands. Their allegedly excessive freedom made the demos hubristic. The whole simile stresses the demos overreaching. They had ideas about their stations. And the hubris of the demos involves no longer obeying the rein. The other example, perhaps even more striking, that's the next slide, comes from a testimonium about the tomb of Critias, the leader of the 30, who shortly overthrew Athenian democracy in 405 and instituted a brutal oligarchic regime before being killed, as we know, and his regime overturned by the Democrats. According to this small text, which comes from a Scholium to Aeschines, Critias' tomb in an unknown city was decorated with the image of personified oligarchy setting fire to democracy with a torch. It included an epigram that read, "This memorial is for the good men who for a short time restrained the accursed Athenian people from hubris." If I could, I would have pronounced this with a posh British accent, something like that. I can't do one effectively, so I didn't try. Accusations of hubris against the lower classes or individual members of the lower classes are recurrent in our evidence throughout the centuries. They are a powerful tool of social control, used by the elite to cast whatever time as rights, prerogatives, power, participation the masses may lay claim to as implicitly unwarranted, unjustified. They mirror as well as counter from the opposing camp, yet relying on the same fundamental logic of social interaction, the frequent prototypical accusations of hubris against the high and mighty, which are instead instrumental to restraining them and to protecting the time of those who do not belong to the elite. The inherent flexibility of the language of hubris, and therefore also the language of time, makes it applicable well beyond social and political struggles between the wealthy and the poor, the few and the many. Two striking examples of this flexibility are found in Thucydides. Next slide. Their accusations of hubris leveled against the inferior are used also in the context of warfare, imperialism, and international relations. The first example on the screen comes from Thucydides' account of an assembly debate in Athens that featured speeches by envoys from Corcyra, a colony of Corinth, which was now at war with its mother city, and from Corinth itself. The Corcyrian envoys were trying to convince the Athenians to join with them in a defensive alliance for the purpose of gaining Athenian protection against Corinth. The Corinthian envoys were trying to convince the Athenians not to side with the Corcyrians. The speeches of the envoys present a long series of grievances and elaborate on contrasting ideas about what the obligations of a mother city should be towards its colony, and vice versa, what level of deference and obedience a colony is required to display towards its mother city. The whole debate seems to revolve around ideas of deference and obligation. At one point, the Corinthian envoy observes that while the Corcyrians complain of being ill-treated by Corinth, it is in fact they who are failing to behave honorably towards their mother city. I quote, "They are our own colonists, but always estranged and now at war with us. They say that they were not sent out to Corcyra to suffer ill treatment, and we for our part say that we did not settle them there to be treated with hubris by them, but to retain our leadership and their proper respect. Certainly our other colonies show us due honor, timosin mas." The Corinthian envoy here sets up a normative framework of sorts for the relations between a colony and its mother city, establishing that to behave honorably, a colony should maintain its links with the mother city, not become estranged from it, acknowledge its leadership, therefore its superiority, and pay due respect to its time. Anything short of this, and the colony is in fact overestimating its own claims to time, overstepping and overreaching, and therefore displaying hubris. As in the examples examined before, here the accusation of hubris sets up an implicit comparison between the two parties, imposing a certain hierarchy based on a certain construction of their respective claims to respect. Describing the attitude and the behavior of the colony as hubris is tantamount to saying that Corcyra has gotten too big for his boots and needs to be put back in its place. Hence, Corinth's war efforts against Corcyra are justified. Next slide. The same strategy is employed at a later point in Thucydides' history in Cleon's speech about the fate of the rebellious Mytileneans. That's from Assassin's Creed. I thought it was a good picture of Cleon. Cleon builds his case for killing all Mytilenean men and enslaving all women and children on the basis of considerations of justice, dike, and retribution. They were treated well by the Athenians, and yet they rebelled against them, so they need to be punished. In the context of this overall line of argument, Cleon at one point observes, and I quote, "For the most part, men are more secure with a regular rather than an extraordinary measure of success. And one could say that it is easier to avoid disaster than to maintain prosperity. From the first, we should never have treated the Mytileneans with greater regard than the others, and then we would not have seen this degree of hubris. It is general human nature to despise indulgence and respect an unyielding stand. This is another instance in which an accusation of hubris is voiced by a character, Cleon, who is himself represented by Thucydides as a hubristes, in the context of a narrative that also suggests that Athens' imperial excesses constitute a form of hubris. Cleon's argument is particularly striking here because he not only accuses Athens' subordinate ally, the Mytileneans, of hubris for daring to stand up to the superior imperial power, but also provides a diagnosis of the causes of their hubris. This diagnosis is perfectly in line with widespread ideas about hubris being connected with excessive good fortune and prosperity, which make one blind to the possibility of reversals of fortune and lead one to overestimating one's claims to time, one's prerogatives, one's strength. Yet, this diagnosis is normally applied to the high and mighty, who become hubristic because of their very superiority. The twist here is that in this scenario, in which the hubris test is in fact the inferior, displaying hubris toward the superior, excessive fortune is recast as excessively lenient treatment from one's master. It has been the Athenians' excessive favor towards the Mytileneans that has made them hubristic. Not only does accusing the Mytileneans of hubris reassert Athens' superiority and the hierarchy between hegemon and subordinate alike, with the relevant obligations of deference and duties. On top of that, the diagnosis of the causes of their hubris ends up justifying the harsh treatment of subordinate allies. They cannot be treated too leniently lest they believe themselves to be equal to their masters and become therefore hubristai. Next slide. The notion that too much leniency on the part of the superior can give rise to the hubris of the inferior is in fact a recurring theme in ancient reflections on another kind of vertical relation, the most extreme of them all. Advice on the management of enslaved workers and dependents, as we find it, for instance, in Xenophon's Economicus, Plato's Laws, and Pseudo-Aristotle's Economica, as well as in Aristotle's Politics, is very much concerned with honor relations between masters and the enslaved. While enslaved persons were institutionally understood not to have any time, Athenian law, for instance, did not grant them any rights, any legitimate claims, ancient authors are aware that in the actuality of the social interactions between masters and the enslaved, and even more in those among enslaved individuals, the emergence of intersubjective networks of claims and obligation, conceptualized in terms of honor, time, was unavoidable. This is a topic I'll discuss more at length tonight, but I'll just broach it here quickly. These texts then are very much concerned with how to structure such relations in such a way as to maximize the exploitation of the enslaved and minimize their potential for insubordination, resistance, and rebellion. In Xenophon's Economicus, for instance, Ischomachus recognizes that enslaved persons are capable of philotimia, literally love of honor, a desire for respect and recognition, and recommends therefore using praise and honor as tools to incentivize their hard work. Plato in the Laws also acknowledges that master and slave relations are unavoidably characterized by dynamics of honor, and that masters normally honor the enslaved to secure their loyalty and good performance as workers. Likewise, the Economica recommend that masters should use the goal of manumission as a tool for encouraging compliance, and that they should treat enslaved persons according to their deserts and reward the more compliant among them with a share of time. Honoring enslaved persons to secure their compliance and hard work may be necessary, but it is also dangerous. It is a balancing act. The pseudo-Aristotelian Economica, in fact, goes on to commend that while honor must be made available to the enslaved for good performance, masters, in dealing with them, must neither suffer them to behave with hubris nor treat them with cruelty. Enslaved persons then can be or become hubristai if they are given too much honor. Next slide. Aristotle is acutely aware of the pitfalls of this balancing act and comments in the Politics that the management of slaves, the proper way to live together with them, is a troublesome matter. Why? For if they are given license, they become arrogant, hybrizzi, and claim equality with those in authority. But if they live miserably, they hate and conspire. Being treated too well results in the enslaved developing hubris, which is described in this instance specifically as believing themselves worthy of and therefore claim equal time and therefore equal rights, timai, with their masters. The use of the verb axio in this passage is significant here. Axia means worth, value, merit, deserve, even dignity, and axio indicates believing yourself to have a certain worth, claiming it, and therefore laying claim to demanding treatment commensurate to your worth. In this instance, then, the hubris of an enslaved person consists in believing themselves to be equal to the master and claiming equal treatment, equal rights. The use of accusations and judgments of hubris as tools of oppression and social control could not be clearer. Next slide. Plato in the Laws elaborates on how to negotiate the balancing act of incentivizing the enslaved while preventing them from developing hubris, and recommends avoiding excessive and unjustified cruelty and mistreatment, but at the same time, I quote, "We should certainly punish slaves if they deserve it and not spoil them by simply giving them a warning as we would free men." He goes on to observe, "Virtually everything you say to a slave should be an order, and you should never become at all familiar with them, though this is how a lot of silly folk do treat their slaves, and usually only succeed in spoiling them and in making life more difficult. More difficult, I mean, for the slaves to take orders and for themselves to maintain their authority." The key issue in all these accounts is to ensure that the enslaved are not led to believe themselves to be the equals of free men. They are not, and for them to claim that status constitutes hubris, which needs to be curtailed through exemplary punishment. Next slide. The most horrifying example of this is perhaps found in an episode narrated by Thucydides in Book 4. According to his account, the Spartans made a proclamation and invited those Hellas slaves in Laconia and Messenia who had served well in the army to come forward to be freed. Those who did come forward, believing that their military service entitled them to freedom, disappeared, and nobody ever knew how they were all individually killed. This brutal shock and awe tactic sent a clear message, in my colleague David Lewis's words, to those who might presume that military service entitled them to be free or that they should have any say in the matter. The proclamation, that is, was meant to identify and eliminate those among the Hellas that were hubristic enough to believe that they were entitled to freedom on account of their merits in war. Any notion the Hellas might have developed that they deserved and therefore had a claim to freedom is conceptualized as a form of hubris, of overstepping and overreaching, thus reaffirming their absolute subjection. Next slide. Demosthenes' speech on the false embassy provides us with a vivid example of how such accusations of hubris against enslaved persons might have served in daily life to reaffirm their absolute subjugation and their obligations of complete obedience toward their masters and the free more generally. In section 196 to 98 that you have on screen, part of it at least, Demosthenes describes his opponent's behavior, Aeschines, during an embassy to Macedon towards an Olympian enslaved woman at a symposium held by one Xenophon. At first, the envoys pressured her rather gently to drink and eat a bit of dessert. But as the affair wore on and their spirits grew heated, they kept prodding her to lie on the couch and sing something as well. The woman became distressed, for she didn't want to sing and wasn't able to, whereupon this man and Phryno, declaring her behavior hubris, said they would not allow her, a loathsome, accursed Olympian prisoner of war, to put on airs. "Summon a slave," they said, "and bring a whip." A slave produced a strap, and since the men, I believe, were drunk and easily provoked, when she said something and began crying, the servant ripped off her short tunic and flogged her back repeatedly. Demosthenes' purpose here is to paint Aeschines in the worst possible light, and so he claims that the tale of Aeschines' behavior circulated widely beyond Macedon and has damaged the Athenian reputation. Demosthenes' narrative works hard to portray Aeschines as himself a hubristes along the lines of several examples I've mentioned. The superior accusing social inferiors of hubris is often in our sources himself presented as a hubris test, and such accusations are part and parcel of his hubristic behavior, because they depend on his overestimation of his claims to female. Yet what makes Aeschines a hubris test in this instance is not his behavior toward a woman per se. The problem is rather that Olynthus and ally of Athens had been captured by Philip II only recently, and its fate and that of its citizens, all sold into slavery after the conquest, was an open wound in the Athenians' collective psyche. This woman, now enslaved, had become one as a prisoner of war, and Demosthenes frames Aeschines' behavior towards her as hubristic by stressing her original free status, her Olympian origin, and her virtue, which are still demonstrated by her behavior. Her actions demonstrate, as it were, that she still deserves to be treated as a free woman. What we can read between the lines is that while such behavior towards what is painted as a free and virtuous woman is undoubtedly considered hubristic, there is nothing intrinsically wrong with it when directed at an enslaved woman per se. An enslaved woman can be molested and subjected to sexual violence at will, and her resistance would constitute putting on airs. For an enslaved woman, refusing to obey, constitutes, that is, hubris, and Aeschines says so in so many words. So we have come back to the importance of representation, of the comparative construction of the respective time of the parties involved with their differential claims to respect in determining what constitutes hubris and what does not. Accusations of hubris could be mobilized to protect the honor of the inferior party, free women, against rapacious behavior from their social superior, free men, but they could also be mobilized to cast any claims to respect, any resistance from enslaved women as unwarranted overreaching, deserving of the firmest and cruelest of punishments. They could be used to keep them in their place. Next slide. And I'm heading towards the end. Be reassured. In the examples I have analyzed, accusations of hubris by the superior towards the inferior consistently serve the purpose of reaffirming the superior's superiority, at the same time putting the inferior in his or her place. They both take for granted and reaffirm the very social hierarchy that underlies the respective superiority, inferiority of the two parties, and by disqualifying the claims of the inferiors as a form of arrogant overreaching, they deny their worth and their dignity. They are, therefore, a powerful tool of social control used by the high and mighty to fend off any challenges to their superiority. In applying also to such scenarios, the ancient concept of hubris helps us to identify and better to understand, I think, in their social and political functions and effects, phenomena that, although they are not normally covered by the modern label of hubris with a U, are pervasive and pernicious also in our time, and yet often prove hard to pinpoint and thematize. This is because in our day too, the protestations of the notional inferior are systematically dismissed and their claims to dignity and respect systematically disqualified. They are actively put in their place through accusations of being loud, aggressive, disorderly, arrogant, entitled, that is, demanding something they do not deserve and have no right to. Such stereotyping seems to be almost invariably attached not only to the lower classes, but to most subaltern groups. These discursive strategies remind us very closely of the accusations of hubris levied in our ancient sources by the high and mighty against the weak as a means of social control. Next slide. The examples are manifold. Perhaps next slide again. Yeah. The examples are manifold. In Britain, Owen Jones has explored how the chavs stereotype, which characterizes the working classes as bigoted, slothful, aggressive people who cannot look after themselves, let alone their children, has provided the excuse to keep them out. This picture is in fact institutionalized in a welfare system designed not to trust claimants, to humiliate them with its obsessive checks and bureaucratic requirements, with its underlying assumption that many of them have in fact no right to be helped. It is not casual that most welfare offices in the UK, which surprised me when I moved there, display prominently notices announcing that abusive language or threatening behavior will not be tolerated. If you are deemed, remember the fantasia, oh yes, if you are deemed to be behaving inappropriately, you will be asked to leave the premises and report it to the police. What is often deemed to be inappropriate behavior amounts to little more than animated remonstrations by claimants that are fighting a system rigged against them to get what they are in fact owed. In my own institution, the University of Edinburgh, the advice place, which is an office meant to assist students who are having a hard time for whatever reason, has been known to report on occasion struggling working class students on disciplinary grounds for being excessively loud, animated, and aggressive in their attempt to secure some hardship funding to pay their rent. In the US, as explored by my colleague Tommy Kerr in his The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, we find similar stereotyping and its similar disempowering, dehumanizing effects applied, for instance, to Black males. Racist accounts of Black males, I'm quoting, depict them as lesser males who are lazy, unintelligent, aggressive, and violent towards women and children, and who abandon their families physically and cannot provide for them economically, while nonetheless requiring coercive legal and extra-legal sanction to control their hypermasculinity and predatory inclinations. Such allegations of aggression, disorderly conduct, and of general lack of desert should be rather familiar by now, as what would in Greek amount to accusations of hubris towards the lower. They are a tool of social control and provide a justificatory framework of exclusion. The same dynamic is at play in the widespread stereotyping of women, not only successful women, but more generally women who are laying claim to equal respect in the workplaces in a variety of other contexts, as they display healthy confidence and assertiveness, are famously described as overconfident, abrasive, pushy, too loud. Their attitudes and behavior and the claims to respect they entail are characterized with this terminology as a form of inappropriate overreaching. They are guilty of hubris for behaving in the same way that is deemed perfectly appropriate for their male counterparts. Such accusations of hubris imply, and at the same time reaffirm, certain criteria of worth underpinning a certain hierarchy. They rely on, and together continuously re-establish, the relative inferiority-superiority of the two parties. So calling out the hubris of another, of a class, of a group, is a powerful ideological tool of social control. It can be and has been effectively used to restrain the arrogance of the wealthy and the powerful. It can be an instrument of democratic egalitarianism, a tool to foster civic cohesion and mutual respect. But it can also be a tool of social control, underpinning extreme forms of inequality and hierarchy, a powerful instrument for the subjection and oppression of other individuals, groups, and classes. Because accusations of hubris are never value-free. They rely on the comparison of different and potentially asymmetrical claims to dignity and respect, and presuppose a certain idea of the correct social order, hierarchical or otherwise, of the correct distribution of social esteem and recognition in a community. Whether a certain attitude or behavior is perceived and described as hubristic, or in modern parlance as arrogance, overconfidence, entitlement, overstepping, or overreaching, depends on what levels of inequality of recognition and esteem we consider justified, on what levels of deference and what levels of basic dignity we consider appropriate, on whether we accept social hierarchies or not. Hubris is in the eye of the beholder, and whom and what we call out for it, whether with the word hubris, with a U, or with other words such as arrogance, says as much about the kind of society we endorse and envisage as about the character of the alleged hubristes. Thank you.
Sure. I'll take over from Ben in thanking Mirko for this fantastic paper and leading our discussion. So, as is our standard practice, we invite people online to type the letter Q in the chat, and then I'll have an order and I'll call on you. James Collin has posted something long. Let's see. I think that's a question. I might read that to kick us off, shall I? Unless James wants to. Okay, given that he's posted, I'm going to guess that he wants me to read it. Okay, in his book on reverence, Paul Woodruff understands irreverence, a synonym for hubris, as a failure to recognize the obligations we have to those greater and lesser than us, as you say. But in his essay on virtues of imperfection, such as reverence, compassion, and good judgment, reverence chief among them, the tragic poets fundamentally remind us that we should recognize our shared vulnerabilities and not try to overcome them. As Decius says, I quote, "We are empty shadows." This prior moral imperative obliterates social and political hierarchies and should lead to compassion. Here's the question: do you see this impulse that dissolves asymmetries alongside the impulse in historiographers and philosophers to preserve social hierarchies?
Thank you very much. Yeah, interesting about Woodruff. He also kind of makes a similar point in the book about Sophocles' Ajax, in fact, talking about respect and deference. So it's very interesting, the point about shared vulnerability and so on. I think that's a key point. And in fact, this is something that is explicitly thematized as such by the Greeks. Basically, the main way to avoid hubris is to recognize a certain level of vulnerability as a way of, as a weakness, or as the fact that fate can turn against us in any moment. The main source of hubris, on the other hand, is the reason for which hubris is often conceptualized as a form of anoia, is the unwarranted assumption that because something has always gone well for us in a certain way, it will continue to go well. I mean, that's the Solon tropos with the Greece story. You find it everywhere. And that is part of the script of hubris. So in a sense, excessive fortune and a mistaken understanding of one's invulnerability is behind hubris. And therefore, acknowledgement of vulnerability is considered by the Greeks very widely as the antidote to hubris. But that's where there's the kind of point that Woodruff makes, and that was been made in the point, is in a way a normative prescriptive point. So if we are conscious and embrace our vulnerability, then there is a counter effect to that counters asymmetries, any kind of notion of verticality. In the Greek sense, if you think about it, based on what I was saying, it's not exactly like that, is it? What it counters is hubris, in whatever manifestation that may be. Think about the passage about Cleon, talking about the Mytileneans, or think about the passages about slaves that are treated too leniently and therefore develop hubris. In a funny way, recognizing, if a slave recognizes that good behavior and good treatment from his master is not a given, and there is a vulnerability, and there is a variation that is possible in the future, that in itself is a reason for the slave to be more differential and live and kind of descend into the asymmetry even more fully. In the same way as if you turn it the other way around, the recognition by the rich and powerful that there is a reversal of fortune, that there is a vulnerability, is an antidote to their hubris. In that way, in that particular construction, there is an equalizing drive towards it, but not in the opposite construction. So I think we need to be a bit careful. Like, descriptively, hubris as overestimation of your own claims within the wider context of social norm and what is appropriate is countered by a healthy recognition of vulnerability. I agree. But hubris is in the eye of the beholder, just as this, which means a recognition of vulnerability can also be a reinforcing factor toward accepting one's subjection. In fact, sometimes recognition of one's invulnerability may be a force towards rebellion, or even overestimating one's relative strength may be the spark that makes somebody rebel against somebody, even if it's not exactly right. So I am very fond of this kind of philosophical research and so on, and I would put in the same box as, I don't know, Martha Nussbaum's recent work on anger and stuff like that. I like what they're trying to do, no? But there is kind of a philosophy of meekness in there, of just kind of being very nice to each other, and if we're all very kind and vulnerable, then the world is juster. And I don't fully buy. I think that stuff is as vulnerable itself to dynamic of social control as anything else. So that would be my response to this.
Thank you. I've got Anthony who's put in, and then I'll throw you out. Okay, Anthony.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mirko, for a wonderful paper, and hopefully you can hear me okay. Oh yeah, good. So I just wanted to ask the extent to which sort of like the logic of hybris assumes that your position within these hierarchies is relatively static and therefore sort of natural. Because in the cases that we had before, it was something like masters and slaves, the aristocrats versus the common people, colonies versus, the fatherland. And so your position here can't change. And I was just wondering if there were any examples of like accusations of hubris that sort of work like this. I was hybristic towards you when I was sort of less high in the hierarchy in respect to X. But now I'm higher in that hierarchy than you, and now you're being hybristic. So how much does sort of the logic of hybris assume that these positions aren't going to change relative to one another?
Right. Okay. Good question. So I think because hubris is a matter of construction, is a matter of imagination, is in the eye of the beholder, the kind of social relation I'm describing are not, even when they are structural social relations in society, they are relevant to accusations of hubris in as much as they are filtered to one's consciousness and one's notions of distributive justice, or one's internalized, Bourdieu would say, habitus, or something like that, no? So in a way, all that I'm describing, although the underpinning is, of course, structural relations in the world, in society, is situational and focalized on the subject and one's point of view, which is the reason for which in many examples I gave, people were saying, you're being hubristic against me. No, you're being hubristic against me. No, you're that kind of dynamic means that, of course, what's changing there is criteria of worth. I mean, it's the kind of, like, the first accusation of hubris that we have in Greek literature is that by Achilles against Agamemnon, isn't it? In that kind of case, Achilles claims that Agamemnon is not respecting his teammate as the strongest warrior, and therefore is arrogating to himself a claim that he does not have and is respecting him. That's hubris. But of course, when Nestor then tells him, well, really, yeah, that's true, but he also he leads more men, no? So you should respect that. And Achilles does not respect that. The implication, well, he also kind of being hubristic there, no? So there is kind of a value pluralism here at play, by which, depending on, what Aristotle mentioned when he said, people concentrate on whatever they have the most of, that's exactly the case in point. So I think all of this is situational, and it's about relative constructions. So there is a situational element and about relative construction and different criteria of worth. That's what we have to look into when we see accusations of hubris. And of course, these, of course, are a layer over what are effectively structural relations. But in a way, in order for having accusations of hubris turning upside down, we don't need structural relations to change. We just need the point of view to change. We may even get somebody finally realizing that the overall system is unjust and therefore starting to perceive something as hubris that until the day before we considered as perfectly normal. I'll talk a bit about that kind of dynamic this afternoon. But so I'm talking about structural relations, but I'm not talking about them as structural relations, but as filtered through somebody point of view and discourse, I think. And there is a deeper truth there that I think Aristotle gets very right, but is also become very prominent in, I don't know, theories of recognition. I'm thinking about the work of Axelon and things like that, which action is filtered through, not just through discourse, but through perception of social norms, and that social reality and do not act per se, not filtered, to create political or social action. Does that answer your question, I think?
I suppose that you were talking before about the negotiation of which criterion to apply, or your relative place within that criterion when it comes to something like Agamemnon versus Achilles. But that's not a case in which Achilles goes, you were better than me, but now I'm better than you. It's just Achilles going, I was always better than you. And Agamemnon going, I was always better than you. But like, the question of whether there's any scope in any examples in, accusation of hybris for the idea that within the same criteria, it has changed over time.
Give an example.
No, I was just thinking though that in the context of the Iliad, as a poem is very conscious of the uncertainty and the ambiguity of that environment. And there's a kind of meta-awareness of precisely what you were pointing out, that Agamemnon and Achilles are not communicating on the same level, and the poem itself is therefore going one step further to say we need a set of general criteria in order to map these two very different people according to a kind of general set of principles, right? Which perhaps we find in the funeral games control system, right? Which is a different way of measuring other than through, say, the distribution of spoil, right? So distribution of spoil turns out to be a bad way of allocating.
Yeah, we're trying to find a shared kind of criteria so that we can.
Yeah.
I think the problem with seeing reversals in the way you Anthony are looking for them is that nobody would. I mean, apart from the passage in Menelaus, which kind of goes in that direction, he says, "I'm starting to think big," you know. It's very difficult to find in the literature anybody that says, "I am a hubris test." That's the difference between how we use hubris with a U in modern discourse and how they used it then. In modern discourse, there's been almost kind of, there's a certain amount of literature, particularly in business studies, but also in psychology, that is trying to medicalize hubris as a syndrome, no? But as they medicalize it, what they do, they say, it leads to all these kind of bad effects as a syndrome, but also, in certain circumstances, curtail can be a lever of self-confidence and to assert yourself and that kind of thing, no? Now, regardless of what we think about that kind of stuff, that's a way in which the two concepts are completely incommensurable. Hubris is, by definition, wrong. There's no example of good hubris. Hubris is hubris precisely because somebody's doing something wrong, which means that usually the kind of passages in Greek literature in which we find somebody admitting to his own hubris is when things have gone terribly wrong, when Ate struck and all of that, and then they say, "All right, that was hubris. I shouldn't have done that. I should have." But by then, like, there's no turning around anymore. That's ultimate ruin and something like that. So,
so in other words, it's moralized in the ancient context always.
Yeah.
Whereas today, in the business studies or the psychology, it's more a psychologized kind of thing, which has social effects that can be
exactly. Yeah. Whereas in the Greek word is a descriptive moralized term for a certain kind of social interaction, who's marked precisely by the fact that somebody is playing the team game, the recognition, mutual intersubjective game wrong. That's basically what it is, no? So you can't play right if the definition of hubris is playing it wrong.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, in a way picks up on that, in a way picks up on pushing back against the philosophy of meekness that you referred to earlier.
So it's a pet, not hate, a pet kind of is.
I think I'm probably just very sympathetic with where you're coming from on it, although maybe I go further to I don't know, you'll see with more of this question. On some level, I think I'm always interested in looking in the places where even today we resonate with the idea of there could be something that's appropriate about seeing someone as an inferior or treating them even with contempt or something like that. And of course, we have such strong egalitarian norms today that most of the examples from Aristotle or whatever we're gonna find abhorrent or they're not gonna resonate with us or whatever. But every so often I try to pull examples and push them on students or push them on my colleagues. I'm gonna do one of these to you to see what you think. And it's kind of just a question about what you see if there are any limits to egalitarian norms that we should have. So here's the example that I'll give you. When I was a graduate student at Princeton, they renamed a building after Toni Morrison, an eminent Black American writer, very well deserved. And when they renamed the building after her, there was a big event. And just like at the beginning of your talk, it was one of those events where the clapping came first, and then when the clapping died down, she said, thank you, I am not humbled. And of course, that's an amazing reversal of expectations. And I've always thought it's such a justifiable one because, you know, a really narrow-minded way you could read it would be something like she's saying that all of you plebs are my inferiors or something like that. A different, obviously more positive way to see it would be something like, you know, she's quite confident and she's just rejecting the sort of philosophy of meekness, humility, virtue thing. And in a way, a little bit more in line with, you know, something like an Aristotelian notion of that, you know, this is a well-merited person that deserves certain kinds of accolades, different than others in her community with the contributions she made, or something like that. I mean, that's a very sanitized version of Aristotle, obviously, but, you know, it's relying on an idea, I think on some level of that egalitarian norms shouldn't be pervasive. There are people that have some special merit. and should, get to not quite be humbled by recognition from their peers or something like that. So I thought I'd just put it to you, what do you think about cases like that, or do you think it should just be, egalitarian all the way through?
Yeah, I think the case about I'm humbled is an interesting one, because I've always felt that there are two ways of reading the standard statement I am humbled. One way of reading them, one way is used, one implication of that is that as I am honored, I am recognizing the superior authority of the body that is honoring me, which means that by accepting the honor and by feeling honored with that, in a way, I am also acknowledging your right to honor me. That can be an horizontal honor relation, in the way in which Athenians are very honored to be honored by their fellow Athenians, and they feel that the value of their reward, of the honor they receive, is higher because given by somebody who is equal. That's kind of the rhetoric as you find in the Against Athenians, but even that, it wasn't uncontroversial, no? But I agree that I think this kind of dynamic can more often in modern society being seen as a recognition of a higher authority. The Queen's honor list, the King's honor list now. Like, you're not kind of receiving whatever it is you get, an OBE or you become Sir or Baronet or whatever you become from an equal. As you feel honored by that, you also kind of realize that there is an inferiority and you acknowledge it, no? That's a more common dynamic in our one day. I think in another sense though, sometimes I feel like when people say I am humbled and so on, there is a bit of an Herodotean angle to that. It's almost apotropaic. As I am elevated, I'm recognizing kind of my vulnerability. Like I feel like, oh, like, no, I don't know. I mean, happens sometimes.
Like almost an evil maneuver. Like,
when you get an honor, you feel, oh God, I'm gonna stumble and fall and crush ruinously now. Is the kind of sense of utter imminent, and I think there is an element that is apotropaic in that. So I think you can read into it, but I see exactly what she's doing in a context in which a black writer and so on is receiving an honor by an institution that traditionally, and I do kind of, and I do see that as a kind of healthy attitude precisely against the kind of philosophy of meekness. I mean, I've worked in kind of, I founded, as Ben was saying, this network working class classicist. I come from that kind of background, so does my wife, and I've got lots of stories. We got over 1,200 responses to this enormous survey, which was humbling. No. We got all these responses, and one thing that came up over and over again was kind of a sense of inadequacy and imposter syndrome and stuff like that, no? And I do think like I was political from a very early stage, which I think gave me a very healthy chip on my shoulder, which meant that I've always kind of watched myself from feeling, oh, they're letting me in, and try to turn it more like, I deserve to be here. You don't. Just get out. That I'm gonna be here on my own. That kind of, but I think there is like, that comes from there, the philosophy of meekness. The point about the equality thing is an interesting one. Although I kind of dabble in philosophy and stuff like that, I do kind of, I'm basically a historian, so I always kind of end up being more sociologically descriptive than I am kind of normative prescriptive, so kind of, and in that sense, I do think that even in the most egalitarian kind of community, what you have is two drives that work against each other. And one of them is a flattening one, and one of them is one towards allowing for social distinction and stuff like that. Even in a place like Athens, when you have an ideology of flattening that is very strong, the honor system is built in a slightly schizophrenic fashion, in which on the one hand, I need to acknowledge people that are really great, but then as soon as I've acknowledged, I'm gonna generalize what I'm giving to them to everybody else because that is unacceptable. And they keep doing this over and over again. And if you see it temporally and historically, you see a dynamic by which what you have is a clash of normative concerns that make a political and social system. And so the descriptive answer would be that I think we're always gonna have both. And I think the ones toward giving people that deserve kind of more and so on more is very rarely in history the non-dominant one, which means that I personally will concentrate more on the other one. I'm just kind of squashing and flattening down, but like, but that I think is a more tentative answer to your question.
Okay, another online question from Yuval.
Okay. Hello, thank you so much for this talk. I suppose my question was already partially answered by the just now, but I would like to ask about honorific degrees and their place in this system, because I suppose we can consider honorific degrees as well, that there is some slight juxtaposition of honorific degrees and other form of social control, that is gossip, because in some honorific degrees there is a formula that says that these honorific degrees can be used as an evidence of good behavior, of noble behavior, something like Martyrius Didoni. And probably this is also true with another form of social control, that is hubris. So probably the political institution can deem that this behavior and this person is worthy of time. So in some sense, a political institution can decide what is hubris and what is not, which is in a way a little bit Hebraistic, I suppose. What is the place of honorific degrees once again in this situation?
Thank you very much, and good to see you. We've mailed in the past. Yeah, so that's a good question. So, okay, I'll take a step back, and I think one of the main results of this 6 years working on honor with many colleagues in Edinburgh and so on is that if I had to kind of mention the main finding that we really like people to realize, no, is that honor is not a thing. What I mean with that is that honor is not, it can be conceptualized metaphorically as a non-material commodity that you exchange, you take from one another and stuff like that, but that's not what it is. It's a dynamic of interaction. But also, it's not a thing in another sense. Honor is not a particular value among many. Like, often in work in which people talk about honor, there is this kind of notion that, okay, some people are interested in profits, some people are interested in virtue, some people are interested in honor. There's a categorical mistake there. Honor is not a value among many. Honor is time, and related term like that is the word for value, which means that all the kind of language that is around it, eidos, time, axia, hubris, all this kind of language we're describing, we're using, no, does not tell us what kind of society a particular polis is. What it does, it tells us what's the mechanism of social and political interaction. That's how they talk about social and political interaction. Then, the normative underpinning of all that, which describes what society is, the filler, we may say, the normative order, that's the value that we are looking for, the kind of values they have. And they are operationalized and made to work by these dynamics of honor, which describe how my motivation works, how my sense of myself is built in connection with you, how things are distributed. So I think that is an important point, which means that when we talk about civic honors, we have an institutionalized grammar of honor that the community gives to people. But of course, that doesn't tell us what kind of arrangement the society has, whether it's vertical, egalitarian, hierarchical, or whatever it is, because honor in itself can be all this kind of thing. I can give you a crown, just that is the equivalent of telling you, well done. The next day, after you got the crown, you are no more of a citizen or a person that you were the day before. You have no differential prerogatives. You have no additional rights. You don't belong to a higher rank. You just got a crown. You see, that's what Stephen Darwell calls appraisal respect. Or I can give you, that's the point, Demosthenes makes in Against Athens. I can do like in Sparta. If you really do very well, I'm going to say you've done very well, and I'm going to honor you by getting you into the Geosia. That's a differential rank. It comes with different prerogatives, with a certain level of control. The language is exactly the same, but they're talking about a very different thing. So in a way, public honor, I think, they work in a variety of ways. If I had to oversimplify it, I would say something happen.
It'll pop back on.
Can people still hear me?
I think it just goes to.
Okay.
The answer was too long. So.
Yeah, they have decided that we really made it going on. So,
I think if you go,
I think it's just the screen
if you
itself.
just touch, if you go and touch the screen.
Oh, okay. Get electrocuted.
okay, yeah, you're still there. Yeah. So I think honors can work in a variety of ways, but 3 ways. You can have the kind of honor that basically like maps civic and magistracy in official honor. Like you are selected by lot for a magistracy, you do your job properly, you don't get indicted in an L2 night, and you also get an honor. If you do something wrong, you don't get an honor, you get indicted. There's no space in between. Or you can get an honor that is appraisal respect, which is value differential, but we want to make everybody the same in prospect. So I'm trying to give you this, but I'm encouraging everybody to be the same. There is an element of social distinction implicit in there, but it's situational, and normatively, I still want everybody to be the same. Or you can have honor as you have often in the Hellenistic period, and increasingly, in which I'm going to give you something that other people don't have. And that's going to make you part of a different group, of a different rank. And then I can formalize a group of Ewergeta or whatever, which have differential rights. The grammar is the same, the dynamics are different. And precisely by understanding the grammar, you don't prejudge the issue, and you can analyze what's going on in each specific policy and period. Does it make sense?
Yes, thank you so much. That was very fruitful for me. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I've got 2 more questions from online towards you, Ben. Do you mind if we get Elkie, and then we can hear Bob's and Ben's together, and then we'll finish? We've got 3 minutes left. Is it okay if I throw to Elkie, Ben? Elkie?
Okay, hi Mirko, nice to see you. Thank you for that wonderful talk. You've given me so much to think about. And I have a kind of general question which draws on a specific example, given your discussion, especially about the relationships between masters and slaves, and in particular, the balance between control and reward that's kind of necessary in the household. That had me thinking about this passage in the Oikonomicus when Ischomachus is describing how he and his wife trained their housekeeper to serve them well, and this is in chapter 9, I think. And he says something like, we instilled in her a sense of justice by making just people more to have more time, and showing her that is just people live lives which are more wealthy and more free than those who are unjust. And of course, you know, surrounding this question is also the reality that this Tamia is enslaved. And so I guess I'm wondering if you could say more about the role of freedom in all this. And, you know, I know you talked about it a bit, especially in the way that it's, you know, this kind of balance is necessary so that inferior people don't think of themselves as having the kind of same rights and worth as free men. And this is just something I've been wondering about, this use of eleutherios to describe what is being kind of held up for these enslaved people in the household.
Yeah, a lot of this is going to be a topic of what I talk about these afternoons. But
sure,
yeah,
okay.
that's a very good question. I think, yeah, I mean, it's part of that kind of trade-off that Aristotle was talking about a bit. On the one hand, you can't use pure coercion and arbitrary kind of power that may keep people in their place in a condition of absolute abjection and subjection, but is very bad at motivating them to comply. And the result is that what you have to do is use incentive. In fact, Aristotle is funny because on the one hand, he uses the theory of natural slavery, but on the other, he says that you can use manumission as an incentive for slave. How does that work? And we actually have his will, and he does manumit his slaves when he dies. So, like, there's a bit of a. I think that's not casual. There is a way in which the institution of slavery is fundamentally untenable on a conceptual level, which means that they just don't. They never quite manage to work it out. And of course, the issue of manumission as reward for good service plays exactly into that kind of model of whoever is more eleutheros or eleutherios. But of course, freedom is a very popular word for metaphorical extension to other areas, whether about certain kind of morality and stuff like that, or certain kind of interpolitical subjection, variety of domination and servitude. That institutional slavery is mapped on a variety of other relations. So you can say very easily that somebody is a doulos, but also say that somebody is more doulikos than somebody else, or there is more, or somebody is free or slave, but is also freer than somebody else, because you're making a metaphorical extension. Of course, when you say that, you are relying on some kind of normative order that you as master are establishing yourself that can be turned on its head. Because if you keep saying to somebody, you're being so deleterious and you're behaving as a free person, I'm giving you more food, eventually the guy's gonna say, well, then why are you not freeing me? And we actually have that. Like, there's 3 or 4 Dodona tablets in which some slaves say, ask the god, will my master manumit me, as he keeps saying that I'm free? No, that kind of plays in that way. So I won't go on too long because it's late, but that's, yeah, I think that's a very important point that I've been thinking a lot about.
Okay, quickly, Bob and Ben.
Thanks so much. I mean, so you had class, ethnicity, enslavement, and gender among your subordinates. I wondered about youth, because I mean, youth and hubris is often associated, but it's usually that they're hot-headed and immature and lacks ferocity to control their violent impulses. But I mean, you've made me think about, is it because they're young, because they're inferior? So I just wondered partly whether you've seen that play out in past actual young people being accused of hubris in that flattening sort of way, but also whether it's got a metaphorical dimension, that it's an infantilizing move to say, oh, you're acting like hubris because you're young, you don't know any better. Is that part of it?
Yeah, I mean, there are, I mean, being young is one of the main traits of being a hubris test. In the classical period in particular, and also in sometimes antique sources too, you find it quite normally like about interpersonal relations. If somebody's a hubris test. In the Hellenistic period in particular, for example, in evidence on Cretan cities and so on, it becomes a significant factor of status. And then you have the young, which are then institutionalized as a particular kind of age group of neoi, as they call them, and they are the ones that want to go to war, or that overreact to things, or do that. And there is an argument about their hubris being a factor of stasis, in fact, in the same way in which more normally you would have the hubris of the lower classes being a factor of stasis. So yeah, it plays political. Later on and in certain contexts in which age groups are very institutionalized, but it does, and in a way that is very consistent with what we've been saying.
Ben.
I've got too many questions, and too many observations, but I think I'll just make one observation and then we can wrap it up, because you've been going solidly for an hour and a half.
Having fun?
I was going to ask about tyranny, and the idea of the tyrant actually coming from the downtrodden, so or being represented as somebody rising above their station, and also, you know, in the Oedipus Tyrannus as well. So there's a lot of hubristic themes in there too. And I wanted to talk about Sparta, but the main thing I wanted to ask was, hubris is ultimately has a spatial metaphor in hubris. If it derives from huper, which means that you're going over the top, right? You're moving from one place to another. And it seems to me too that some of the kind of reflections on the hubristic individual is that they're sort of exiting the circulation of a human society in which they owe obligations to other people. Right? So in other words, if I wanted to say, well, I'm hubristic in my claim to stepping outside of society and removing myself from its obligations. And of course, this aligns it with the tyrant, because the tyrant is somebody who says, I am not part of this normative order, rather my situation has allowed me to step outside it, and therefore to observe it from, I'm no longer part of it, and so therefore I'm not bound by its rules, right? You know, in Samos, when Euclides type tyranny falls apart, and Leandrios does that, says to the demos, listen, I'm happy to hand power, Kratos, back to you, so long as you give me this priesthood of Zeus and a kind of stipend for my family and allow me to sit alongside the polis, but not to be part of it, but to exist outside it, like a kind of, and this outsideness, I think, of the hubristic individual is an interesting one. And that's particularly the case with Oedipus, who's brought, the retribution against Oedipus is precisely to relocate him back into the heart of affairs, to bring him back from his position of outside and so on. To bring him back.
That's a good point. I mean, I think that the hyper kind of etymology is, people think it's probably a paretymology, no?
Mm-hmm.
But still there is a basic kind of mechanism of metaphorical mapping that tends to go from concrete or space and so on to which means that even if it wasn't the real etymology, that would have been perceived as something like that, no?
There's a crossing.
And there is like hubris and hyperenae and that kind of thing, and also thinking big. And also hubris is connected with all this kind of metaphors about, for example, nature being explosively, I don't know the English word, like but anyway, like
Luxurious,
yeah, that kind of thing. So there is an element of kind of getting it beyond your bounds and stuff like that in the language of hubris. I think in the sense of that being played out as calling yourself out of normal kind of political and social interaction, you can, hubris itself is about thinking you're too big for what's request, but also it's interesting that hubris usually tends to go hand in hand with an idea. So if you don't have a sense of eidos, you don't feel shame, but you don't respect others, and you don't care about what other people think of you.
Yeah.
And if you don't care about what people think of you, then you're basically out of it and do whatever you feel like. These kind of things tend to go together. So yeah, I think there's definitely an element of that.
And therefore, it's alongside the rise of the individual. Right? So the individual who feels that they owe no obligations.
Yeah.
And
in terms of the tyrant, I mean, hubris is one of the main characteristic of most tyrants. But I think precisely because the tyrant is prototypically hubristic, they kind of attribute to the tyrant any kind of configuration of hubris, depending on the context. So sometimes the tyrant is getting above himself because he thinks he's above the law, and he's tyrant precisely because he thinks he's above the law and all of that. Sometimes he's hubristic because it's a vile demagogue that elevates himself as that kind of thing. Sometimes you have this kind of notion, like you find in Aristotle, book 5, in which he says that the only way you can normatively justify tyranny is if you have a system in which one guy is so much better than everybody else, then therefore the just distribution is that he's got sole power. And he says that because tyrants know this, that's why he uses the periander kind of thing, the one about the grain and the cutting of the grain to make. So he cuts everybody down, so he's actually so much higher than everybody else. And he recommends a strategy to justify tyranny. So I think there is a case in which the prototypical feature of hubris of the tyrant means that the tyrant is going to be hubristic in some sense, whatever he does. Because the tyrant, by definition, does not live appropriately within the constraints of time and of relations.
thank you.
Congratulations on bringing this research project to a conclusion. That's amazing. We're looking forward to the next one. And
First, I need to finish the book.
Well, we look forward to the book and the next one. And please join me in thanking Mirko